The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. All right. So let me do this. Okay, fantastic. Well, again, thanks for joining. I really appreciate you all taking the time, and it's so cool to see such a global audience. If you do have questions as I go on, I will leave 10 minutes around the end to do a Q&A, but if you have questions throughout, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and hopefully that will pop up on my screen. So yeah, so in terms of VR training, right? I've been doing this since 2016. So I've been doing this for many years. And the one thing that I've seen the most in terms of VR training at organizations, the number one reason it fails is because people don't have a clear idea of why they're doing it in the first place. And I know that sounds really obvious, right? Clearly, you need to know why you're doing something. But a lot of the time, something like this happens. Your boss, the head of the company, an executive, whatever, they go to CES or they read an article in Wired or they have some exposure to new technology. And then what happens is they get all excited, they get super into it, and then they come back and they delegate out and they say, we need to do VR, right? We need to do AI. We need to do such and such. And then somebody in the org sort of passes it down, passes it down, passes it down. It winds up on your desk. You have no real clear direction. You kind of are like, all right, let's just do a VR thing. You might find a company to build something for you. You might find something off the shelf. You buy a bunch of headsets. You do a pilot, and then it slips into what I call pilot purgatory, which is you've done this pilot, you've probably had some success, maybe, but there's no real incentive for you to keep going and to scale. And that's because when you started, you didn't start with the sort of clear understanding of what problem you were solving in the first place. The problem you were solving was, oh, my boss wants me to do this, or oh, the CEO wants me to do this. And then, of course, that's not going to go great. And so then it kind of goes on the ash heap and it's a waste of money and everyone's time. And then you kind of lather, rinse, and repeat with every other new technology that happens. So, one of my goals is to kind of put a stop to that and then have people start by asking themselves, this basic question, which is why isn't our training working, right? Why are we not accomplishing our goals? And there are three main buckets that this sort of tends to fall into, right? So the first is you have interesting information, but the presentation itself is not that interesting. So a lot of companies rely on PowerPoint, and I do realize the sort of deep irony of talking about how boring PowerPoint is while I'm giving you an hour where I'm using PowerPoint. We're not all in VR yet. Eventually we will be, and then I can do that. But this is not that interesting, right? Even well-designed PowerPoints are still like you're staring at a flat screen for hours on end. There's no interactivity. It's easy to tune out. I'm sure many of you are playing this in the background while you're checking your emails or reading the news or doing anything. That's fine. I do the exact same thing when I'm not leading a workshop, right? So, this kind of like online training with somebody droning on and then a PowerPoint, again, fully understand the irony of this, right? People don't absorb it. It doesn't hold their attention. And especially if you're going for long periods of time, it really doesn't hold their attention. People just start tuning out. They have short attention spans now. So that's the first, right? You might have really good information that people need to know, but the way it's being presented is just not aligning. The second is an issue of scale, right? So this sort of in-person interactive training works really well, right? I'm not saying it doesn't. The issue is it's hard to standardize, it's hard to scale. So in terms of standardization, you know, everyone has an off day. Everyone has a bad day. Some people are better teachers than others, right? So it's very hard to get sort of a standard across the board type of training when you have a human delivering it because humans just because of their humanness have on days and off days, right? Um, and then with scale, again, if you're in a room with humans, right? That's hard to scale because again, that's a lot of time, it's a lot of energy, maybe people have to travel, there's budget involved, right? If you want to practice something again at 3 in the morning, you can't just call your trainer at 3 a.m. They would not enjoy that, right? So it's very hard to kind of take it from 0 to 1 when it's all done by humans. Um, and then you talk about like role playing, right? People get put on the spot, you know, it's hard to do that sort of off the top of your head in an environment where you might be uncomfortable. If you're doing a role play with your colleague, it's very hard to sort of separate out the fact that you're role playing with somebody from, your colleague from accounts or whatever. Like, it's really hard to kind of get into that in a meaningful way. So that's the other thing, the scale issue. And the third is the cost issue, right? Again, bringing people together in person is great, but it's really hard to do. It's a time issue, it's a finance issue, it's an environment issue. So there's one company that I've consulted for in the past where they would do these big quarterly trainings where once a quarter everyone would come for a week to their headquarters in Dallas, and they would have to fly them from all over the world. They have to put them up in a hotel. They're away from their families for a week. They're away from their actual jobs for a week, right? And it was a lot of time and money and energy. And when COVID happened a couple of years ago, they had to really rethink, okay, now we can't do this in person anymore. How can we do this? And not just sort of replace it temporarily, but make it better. And also with the cost, if you're training on like specialized equipment, and it breaks, that's obviously very, very expensive. The cost of taking something out of service in order to train people on it can be very expensive. KLM Airlines, which is the Dutch flag carrier, started using VR in it's been a while now, 2018 maybe, to train their pilots. And what they were doing that was really interesting was, the pilots have to amass a certain amount of credit hours flying. So prior to 2018, they would have to take the planes out of service, send them up to basically just kind of like fly randomly around with no passengers on board, but still have to pay for the fuel. And then the pilot would, train on that and then eventually be able to go up in the air with passengers. Now, I'm not saying you want a pilot who's like never been in a plane before they fly with passengers. That would be terrifying. But what this has done is it's cut out a lot of that extraneous training time. So that's been a solve for both the pilots because then they can just kind of train whenever. It's not as big of a deal. And it's also great for the airline because those planes can then be, up in the sky, ferrying passengers around, making money for the airline as opposed to just kind of being used as training tools. So there's a couple, again, really good examples there. So again, this is not like the sum total of all the problems people could have, but these are just the things that I see time and time and time again. So with that being said, feel free to drop this in the comments and again, I know I'm putting people on the spot because I just started talking about this, but if anything is really resonating with folks and it springs to mind, like, what are your biggest pain points? What are your biggest learning and training pain points? If anyone wants to just drop in the comments, and we can revisit this as well at the end. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, engagement, right? How to motivate. Yeah, engagement. Yeah, I mean, this is a really big issue and it's a really challenging issue. Yeah. Push versus pull. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like, what exactly is push versus pull? I'm gonna take a break and have some water. How to embed learning with work and translate into performance. Yeah, exactly. And how do you and we'll get into this in a second, but there are certain things that, are sort of emergency situations that you want to be able to train people for in the hopes that they never actually encounter them. Yeah, attention, how to keep it interesting, how to handle right? So yeah, lack of support from management, that's unfortunately a little bit outside the scope of a solvable problem for this. Although there's definitely a lot of evidence that you can show to management that this type of training works really well. But definitely, how do you keep it interesting? The attention, right? Everyone's distracted. Everyone's got a million things going on. Everyone's super busy, and it's just really hard to get people to focus, right? And then again, especially if the information that's being presented isn't, being presented in a really interesting way, that's super hard. So these are all really good. And again, if you think of more, let me know. So again, this is just like a big, broad generalization, right? So, I think we've aligned on a couple things, right? We want stuff to be interactive. We want it to be attention grabbing. We want it to be like quick and fun and bite size and really get people immersed in this training. So with that being said, let's talk about what works and what doesn't, right? Because it seems like now a lot of folks have at least an idea of what they're trying to solve, right? So now it's like, all right, is this type of training actually a solution? So the things that work really well, hands-on hard skills training. So this is fixing a part in a data center. This is how do you, put this widget and that widget together to form a new widget, right? How do you put on personal protective equipment if you're going to work in a clean environment? Like all of those type of things, that this type of training works really well. People can practice as much as they want. They can do it at scale. It's very hands-on, but it's not dangerous, right? So these are all the like that sort of training is like really good bread and butter for an immersive training. Critical human skills that are conversational in nature. So again, a lot of people have a hard time with the role play because it's very hard to sort of get over that idea that like, yeah, this is actually somebody I work with, or yeah, this is a trainer that's been brought in, right? People have challenges with that. And, you know, the human you're talking to is kind of limited by their own experiences. Oftentimes role plays are like really scripted. So with this type of immersive learning, specifically with the artificial intelligence and the AI powered virtual humans, right? You can build these conversations at scale. So let's say tomorrow you have to go in and have a really difficult conversation with an employee who is showing up for work late all the time, right? And you know why they're late? It's because they are a single parent and they have childcare issues. But at the same time, like they have to be there, right? So how do you approach that in an empathetic manner while also getting to a solution, right? That's a hard discussion for a lot of people to have. It's hard to give people negative feedback. It's hard to sort of do problem solving. So you can actually build these virtual humans very easily at scale and get to a point where like you can just spin one of these up, practice with it, and then when you get to that actual conversation, you feel comfortable, right? So it's not like you're going to follow a script or they're going to follow a script. It's really the idea of, okay, I know how to react if somebody gets really upset at me. I know how to react if somebody starts crying and they say, oh, and they've got a sob story about whatever and drama, 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 right? You know how to deal with that stuff. So it really allows you to like practice these conversations, get good at them, get comfortable with them, and get feedback on how to be better. Critical human skills training with empathy. Now, people talk about empathy in VR a lot. There's a guy, Chris Milk, who's a pretty well-known VR creator. He gave a TED talk in 2014, I think, like a really long time ago, where he said VR is the empathy machine. And sure, yeah, it is kind of. I mean, obviously, it's a lot more. But basically, what VR can do is allow you to feel things that you would not otherwise be able to feel. So, an example, and we'll go through some case studies in a little bit, is being excluded in a workplace, right? So a client of ours several years ago was building a whole training program around workplace inclusion. And we're having a hard time selling it in because a lot of the people that were kind of the end decision maker are people that are not historically excluded in a workplace, right? They are kind of in crowd, right? They're senior management, they kind of look a certain way, act a certain way. And so we built this VR piece for them where basically you just kind of come as yourself, right? You are a manager at a company, you are having a meeting about like vendors or something like that. That stuff was kind of irrelevant. The idea was everyone that you interacted with dismissed you, talked over you, they were very clicky, your boss gave you all this contradictory advice, and no matter what you did, because it was an interactive piece and you interacted by speaking, you couldn't get around it, you couldn't win. So it was not meant to like teach anything necessarily. It was meant to really like allow people to feel what that type of situation felt like. And it had really profound impacts on a lot of the people that saw it. They changed the way they thought about this stuff. They changed the way they ran meetings. Like it worked really well, right? And that's something only VR can do. So that's really exciting. And then critical human skills training with emotional intelligence. So this is going to be really, really huge, especially as AI takes over a lot of the sort of more rudimentary parts of our work. One of the biggest skill sets that we're seeing is the ability to be sort of emotionally intelligent, to manage people well, and to understand people's emotions. So there's a piece that I've always wanted to build, and I promise I will find somebody who will fund it because I really, really want to build it. And it's a VR piece on sexual harassment. Now, sexual harassment, when it's normally people are doing trainings around it, it tends to be very sort of comical, over the top kind of era. If any of you've seen Mad Men, that kind of era where they're, chasing the secretaries around. But that's often not how it plays out in real life, although those happen sometimes. But generally, it's more kind of crossing lines that you might not have even known you were crossing, kind of these blurred conversations where people have kind of different takes on things, right? So it tends to be much more nuanced than what we generally think of as like somebody saying, oh, if you go to bed with me, I'll give you a promotion, right? That doesn't happen as much, although it unfortunately does still happen. So the idea with the VR piece is you are in a headset, you're sitting across from somebody at a table, and you say something that's like kind of borderline, right? Could be construed either way. Now, if the person is like they lean forward and they're like, "Oh my God, that's so funny," right? Then you know you're probably on stable ground. Then you know you're like, okay, cool, this person they're okay with this, right? Now, the other part of the time you would get somebody where you'd say the exact same thing, like, that's so funny. Right? Same words, right? They're laughing, they're saying that's so funny, but completely different reaction. And so then you would be able to understand, like, oh, I can read this person's tone of voice, their cadence, their body language, and understand that, like, okay, I'm making them uncomfortable. I'm going to stop and I'm going to either just leave them alone or talk, neutral topic. And I really want to build this. I cannot tell you how like life-changing this would be for many just like women who exist in public, right? Because I mean, if you are a woman, right, you've probably been like out at a bar and some guy started chatting with you and you're like, okay, okay. Like you're giving every signal other than being like, go away. And the men are like, just no, 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 no. And it's like, dude, leave me alone, right? Because they don't get it. Now, part of it could just be they don't care. They just want to talk at you, right? But I think a lot of it is like, again, people aren't taught to sort of read other people's reactions in a critical way. So I'm going to build that eventually. And then the last is training for situations that are dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or expensive. This acronym is DICE. Jeremy Bailenson, who's an amazing VR creator and professor at Stanford, came up with this, and I love it. So training for situations that are dangerous, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. If you are training somebody how to work on like a really dangerous piece of equipment or go into like an active shooter situation, right? You want somebody to feel very comfortable in that. You want somebody who's well practiced and you don't want to put them at risk. Situations that are impossible, this is like an interesting one. So last year, I worked with a hospital chain in Utah, and they wanted training for people that were sort of like the hospital emergency managers. And what this is basically after Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans in 2005, nobody was really in charge of the hospitals, right? It was all kind of very ad hoc. They hadn't really planned for this. So out of that, at a hospital called Memorial, there were several people who were essentially euthanized by a doctor who thought they were doing the right thing, thought they were within the bounds of the law. It turns out they weren't. It was very controversial. So as a result of that kind of disaster, right, a lot of hospitals and states said, okay, there needs to be clear guidelines. You need to have a person who's the appointed decision maker, on and on and on. So, you want to train these people and you hope they never have to use this training, but they have to be well trained and they have to remain calm and they have to really like know exactly what they're doing in a high stakes situation like this. So we built this VR piece where, the scenario is basically there's been an earthquake, massive earthquake, the hospital's at capacity, they're going to collapse. And you, as the emergency manager, right, you don't know if your family's okay. You don't know if your house is still standing, what's happening in your community. And everyone is screaming at you, basically. And you have to remain calm. You have to, use this legal framework to make decisions about rationing patient care. But you also have to do that with a clear head when, again, you're like, is my family dead? Is my house okay? Everyone is screaming at me and people might have to die because of the decision I've made. So again, this is very high stakes training. And we want people to be able to practice this a lot, get really comfortable with it, and hope they never have to use it. Counterproductive is kind of an interesting one because it allows people to make mistakes and do things wrong and learn from those consequences. So it can be very interesting in certain circumstances to let people make potentially even catastrophic mistakes in an environment that is safe because they can see the outcomes. And then expensive, that's kind of an obvious one, right? If you're training somebody on, an airplane engine or something, you want them to be able to make mistakes in a headset because then you can just click a button and okay, now we're good, versus like breaking this expensive piece of equipment. Again, that's not the sum total of things that work well, but that's just kind of some really good examples. Things that generally don't work well, every so often people are like, oh, I want to use VR to teach people how to use Excel. And I was like, No, don't. God, that sounds terrible, right? Like, just teach people how to use Excel on a computer. You don't need VR to do that. Um, Training on really simple things. I mean, again, you certainly can build a VR piece, training somebody how to like close a door. You don't really need to, right? I mean, there's certain things that are so simple it doesn't it's like almost overkill. And then training on things that are rote or scripted. So if you are doing like patient intake interviews and it's just reading off a script and you just ask them questions based on the script and you've got the script in front of you, you don't need to practice in VR because it's like, why are you even doing it? Again, like I've seen stuff that's built for this purpose. It's fine. It's not going to hurt anyone, but it's not sort of the best value for money in terms of if you are going to invest in creating this content. Just make sure we're good on time. Okay. So now that you've kind of come up with, okay, here's what the issue is, here's why we need to solve it, and does it fit within these guidelines? Now you've kind of got a really good starting point, right? The next thing you need to do when you're thinking about a VR piece, and I know this sounds really counterintuitive, but just stick with me, is you need to think about the emotions of the piece. And I'm sure you're like, oh, hold on, we're teaching people how to do things. Yeah, you are. And that's the next piece. But this is such a powerful medium that you really need to think how people are going to feel when they take the headset off, right? You kind of need to start there and then you can work everything backwards from there. So again, this is not like the sum total of human emotion, but this is really like, okay, what are some places we can start with? So a really good one for training is empowerment, right? How do you make people feel empowered by this piece? Do you want them to feel like, oh yeah, if I need to talk to somebody about their chronic lateness or their problems or whatever, I can do it. I've practiced. I feel comfortable. I feel like I've got it, right? Do you want them to feel empowered to like make tough decisions or be in tough situations? Like that's a really good outcome. Um, Conflicted works in certain circumstances. So there's a piece in the case study here I'll talk about in a second for Accenture, where they were doing training for child welfare workers. And part of what they wanted was something that was allowed the child welfare workers to practice asking these conversations, practice doing interviews with families in crisis, and practice making decisions. But it was never really clear if you'd made the right choice or not, right? Because that's true to life. Child welfare workers, yeah, sometimes you walk in and it's just like a kid is, punched in the face, and then that's a pretty obvious one. You get the kid out of there. But a lot of the times that's not the case. A lot of the time it's like, okay, well, these people are struggling and they're living in poverty, but that's obviously not child abuse, right? Being poor. Yeah, the house is messy, but also like little kids are messy, like understanding what you should be looking for exactly and making this decision that has really, really huge impacts on families. So allowing people to sit with that discomfort can be really powerful if that's what you want. And again, do you want people to feel uncomfortable, right? There's like that example. There's the example of the workplace inclusion, right? We did a piece on racial bias where you were at the receiving end of a bias incident. Like that can be really, really powerful to make somebody who's never felt something feel like, oh, this is terrible. The flip side of that is, do you want to make people feel excited? Do you want to make them feel like, okay, I'm pumped to go do this. This is a cool task and I'm going to do it. And it's almost like a game and I'm going to get really into it. Empathy, again, huge advantage of doing this type of immersive training. You can make people feel empathetic. Happiness, all is good, right? Giving people that sense of like, oh, I'm excited to do this. I'm happy to do this. This is cheering me up. Don't feel sad. If you're doing stuff around like social impact, that can be really powerful. I was teaching a course in North Carolina at a university down there a couple years ago now, and a woman, her pitch for the course was basically she was going to do something about animal adoption and shelters, and she was going to shoot it from the POV of a dog that had been like left in an animal shelter. And I was like, that's amazing. I'm not going to watch it because it'll kill me, right? It's going to depress me too much. But again, if that is like, if you're doing social impact work and that's your goal, it's a really good one. And then confidence, right? Allowing people to practice, to gain mastery, and to feel like, okay, if I go out and do this, I know what I'm doing. There's a lot of like football players and athletes that use VR for training. And one thing that a lot of them have said is they get out onto the field and they feel like they've done the play 50 times. They've done it in VR. So they're very confident that they can pull it off. there's no like right or wrong answers here, right? It all really depends on what you're trying to do. But again, the overall thing is the feeling should drive all of the creative. The next thing to talk about is skills versus behaviors. So you can train for both. You can train for both in the same piece, but you need to be very clear on what it is you're training for because you kind of approach it a little bit differently. So a skill is straightforward, right? How do you fix a part in a machine? How do you operate and make decisions in a legal framework? How do you use a medical device? And then behaviors, right? Are you a good listener? Are you attentive? Can you have a difficult conversation and remain calm? Again, you can train for both at the same time, right? So the example I just shared about the hospital collapse, right? You are training people how to operate within a legal framework. You're also training them how to remain calm in a difficult situation. But you really need to dig in and understand, like, okay, is it a skill issue or a behavior issue that we're having this problem? So here's an example. I was working with a hospital, another hospital chain. I work with a lot of hospitals. And they had identified that a problem they had was patients getting sepsis, which is a really, really serious medical issue. And they thought that the issue was because they had these new catheters that they were using. The nurses hadn't been properly trained on insertion. And because of this, like bacteria was getting in and causing cases of sepsis. So they were like, cool, we're going to do a VR training on how to like correctly use this catheter and how to correctly insert it and make sure it's clean. Like it's a clean field and everything. Okay, great. But then they dug a little bit deeper, and it wasn't necessarily about that. It was that a lot of the nurses didn't understand the initial things to look for when somebody was initially getting sepsis because they just weren't trained on sort of paying that level of attention, right? So it was really understanding this isn't a skill issue, right? This is not an issue of like, here's how you create a sterile environment when you put in this catheter. It was really about how do you pay attention to early stage symptoms and signs that could then lead to something worse. So that's where we kind of had to really, really dig deep and focus. So again, training for skills is great, training for behaviors is great, training for both is great. Probably should be one or the other, right? Unless it's like just vibes. But you really need to understand what you're training for and what the root cause of the need to do the training is. So then we come to the next part, which is defining the learning. I'm flying through this. Usually I give this in like a multi-hour, sometimes multi-day presentation. So I am kind of flying through this because I know we only have an hour. So again, if, I'll do the Q&A at the end. Let me just look and see if there's any other messages. Figuring out ROI, yeah. So again, I'll leave time at the end for questions. So defining the learning, right? So you've come up with the emotionality, you have the idea, and you have this concrete lesson, what you want people to learn at the end of the piece, right? This is, again, where so many programs just fall apart, is because people don't have this outcome in mind, right? So you do something and it's great, and then you have everyone in headset and everyone's excited, and then it's like, okay, well, what did this actually do? And if you can't answer that question, then you're toast, right? Especially in this economy. A couple of years ago when interest rates were zero, people were a little bit more like, all right, yeah, just go build a thing. It'll be fun, right? We're spiffy. We'll do a Forbes article about it, right? Yeah, unfortunately, that era has ended thanks to the Fed and thanks to COVID. So now we're in a stage where you really need to provide that ROI, that value, okay? So this is kind of how you start thinking about that. For hard skills, it's like really generally easy to define. Can the user fix the computer part? Can the user climb a telephone pole safely? Whatever it is, can they perform the skill? And VR is really, really good for this. So there was an experiment, 2019, I believe, where Imperial Medical College in London and Johnson & Johnson and Meta designed this VR training piece for trainee surgeons. It was like how to do a knee replacement. So they divided the class into two groups. One group trained in VR, the other group trained as they normally would have. And then they had to go into a lab and basically do this procedure on a cadaver. And 83% of the group that had trained in VR were able to do it with minimal guidance, like just after the VR training. None of the original group were, 0, right? Now, to me, that number speaks for itself. And that data also like is consistent across several other, experiments and research that's been done around VR in terms of like the efficacy of VR training how people learn faster, they retain more information, on and on. Um, and that stat came out, what, like 6 years ago? And it's still an uphill battle to get companies to adopt this training. So, like, who knows? I would think 83-0 is a pretty good selling point, but all right. Anyway, so you really need to sort of say, okay, can people actually do this, right? And test it. For the critical human skills, like, that's trickier, right? I understand that. Because you're focused on, like, critical thinking, creating feelings. You don't want people to just get in there and recite a script, right? That never works. If you have a hard conversation with somebody and you're, like, reading off a piece of paper, um, yeah, that's not a good experience for anyone involved. But there are ways that you can still come up with measurements, right? So you can survey people, you can survey, like, the people who did the training. Do you feel better about these conversations? You can survey the people they manage. Do you feel like your manager has improved in terms of communication? You can look at employee turnover. So that's a huge problem for a lot of organizations, right? It costs a lot of money. It makes things, difficult to maintain consistency throughout the org. So you can look at, did our turnover go down, right? That's the Accenture piece. Um, One of the first states that adopted it, their turnover rate dropped by like a third, which is huge, right? Are we getting sued less? I know this is, we have a global audience, so this is maybe a more America-centric, very litigious society. But, again, if we do a piece on sexual harassment training and our sexual harassment lawsuits drop by 50% or complaints or whatever, that's a good measure. So again, I don't want to be super prescriptive here, but you need something to measure against in order to justify the piece and justify continuing to make this content and invest in it. And then the last thing I want to touch on is, who is the user, right? Because I've seen a lot of VR where people don't understand who that is, right? Or what that is. The user is the camera. So when you're shooting this stuff, you're building the stuff, the 360 camera is who the user is, right? Everything needs to be oriented around them. The person, when they're in headset or when they're going through the piece, right, they need to be present, they need to be acknowledged, and they need to interact. There's a lot of little things that people get wrong, and I go really deep into this in my normal workshops. I don't have time to go into it today, but I'll share a couple stories. So many years ago, I was doing a VR piece on the road to the NBA Finals, the American basketball. And it was a really good piece. Like, I really, really liked it. It was cool storytelling and great shots. And like, I enjoyed it, but something about it was off. So I went through this entire piece and I watched it and I interacted with it. And I took the headset off and I turned to my colleague, this guy that I work with a lot, who's much taller than me. I'm 5'4" for reference. I'm a tiny little girl. He's like a 6'1", 6'2" guy. So I turned to him and I was like, there's something weird about this and I cannot figure it out. Can you help me? He's like, okay. So he puts on the headset and within a minute, he takes the headset off and he's like, I know exactly what it was. He goes, you were at eye height with the players. So you were all of a sudden 6.5, 7 feet tall. And that's weird because you're used to, if you were standing next to a basketball player, right, looking up at them and feeling short. And now you're not doing that. And that's kind of weird for you because you were never defined as that, right? If you come into the piece and been like, oh, you're a basketball player, right? I could have been like, okay, that's why I'm so tall. But because that was never defined, it threw me off a little bit. And that's kind of an esoteric example. But the one thing you have to think about is, again, people are living this, they're experiencing it. So if you're asking people to all of a sudden be super tall or super short or super this or super that, it can be really challenging. Now, there are times when you can use these camera angles to your advantage. So let's say you're doing a piece about empathy for people who are in wheelchairs or using mobility aids. Then you can set the camera low because that's the correct perspective of somebody who's in a wheelchair or using a mobility aid. And all of a sudden, people can see things from that perspective. And that can be really powerful. Again, they have to know that is the purpose, not like, oh, you just put the camera too low because you didn't raise the tripod high enough. But, it's thinking through stuff like that. It's thinking through distance and interactivity, right? So really understanding like how the user is interacting with the scene at every single point along the way, really, really critical. don't ask people to pretend to be somebody else in VR in this type of VR, right? In games, right? There's a Oculus just released a new Batman VR game, which looks really cool, right? People who play video games can make that leap and be like, okay, now I'm Batman, right? For people who are doing, work training, empathy training, if you ask them to all of a sudden be like, I'm a Black woman or I'm a Latino man, and they're not, it's a little bit of a jump, right? It's a tough jump. And that will immediately create sort of an other effect, right? So I'm not that person, so I don't really need to pay attention, right? You want people to experience this stuff as themselves. That is the most powerful way you can do it. You can give them direction based on, and you can and you should, right? Give them direction based on who they are in terms of their user base. So you're an executive at a firm, you're a customer at a store, you're a new caseworker, right? You want to give them that context so they're not just like dropped in and being like, what am I even doing here? But you don't want to ask people to embody another race or gender identity or anything like that, because that will create this weird scenario. All right, cool. Got like a couple more minutes and I'll do Q&A. So I'll go through some case studies with you really quick. So this one I talked about a little bit. This is the workplace inclusion piece. You can see, we work at this global consulting firm. And again, if you look at the bottom of the quote, right, this guy who, was a tester on the piece, in fact, I don't think he even saw the final piece. He just saw like our tests. He said, this wasn't a conversation, it was an emotional experience. And he changed the way he ran meetings at his org based on that. And, it really had this profound impact because, again, like you were experiencing this and you were experiencing this in a safe environment, right? You're in headset and you're experiencing something that you couldn't otherwise feel. I'm going to skip over the video because it's really cheesy. It's like a super cheeseball promo video that we did not create. But I just have it in there. So this is the child welfare case study, right? You can see in this one we shot a little differently. We shot it on green screen and composited it into a background. You don't need to do that anymore. That was because this was like 2018 technology. Luckily we've advanced so that we don't have to do it like this, and it's much easier, which is nice. But again, you can see here, this was a really long piece too. This is 20 minutes long, voice activated, branching narrative. Like this was a big, intense, big budget, thankfully, piece. Obviously it had really big impacts. It's done really well. Like Accenture's done a bunch more of these. We've worked on a couple with them to follow up. And so like, again, this is the type of thing that is really powerful and really moves the needle. I'm gonna skip over this promo video too, because it's also cheesy. One of these days I'll do like a good non-cheeseball promo video for a piece that I've done. But today's not that day. And this last one, racial bias, again, this was for a chain of home improvement stores in the US. And they'd had some bias incidents in their stores, right? People had been racially profiled. And so we wanted to allow somebody to feel what that was like. And so that was a tricky one because, how do you do that? And so we basically came up with a scenario where you're in the store, you're waiting for your friend, and you've got like a backpack in your shopping cart. And so you're just kind of loitering around with a backpack. And that kind of raises the suspicions of someone in the store, and this person is talking about theft, and they're kind of in your face, right? And you don't know who you are. All you know is this guy's decided to target you because you have a backpack. And then the next part of the piece was you were now a store employee or store manager, and you were talking to this person who'd been on the other end of this bias incident. And the big reveal is this is an older Black man, and you had to walk him through like, okay, here's the steps for filing a complaint, and you had to do it empathetically and kindly, and also within the framework of this company for how to file a complaint. And so it was, again, a really like interesting, eye-opening, challenging piece, and people got pretty upset and pretty angry when they went through the piece, which I think was, in this case, the intended effect. So there's just a couple. I mean, again, I've touched on others. I've certainly worked on a lot of others. I'm working on a piece right now, actually, for a big company about feeling like no one understands what you're saying, because it's a global company and there's a lot of international workforce. Some of them have like limited English proficiency, right? So it's really creating the sense of like, if you're in a place and you're trying to be understood, nobody understands you. What does that feel like? How uncomfortable can that be? So that's my current creative challenge right now that I'm going to be working on and trying to figure out. Anyway, so then we get into like the sort of nuts and bolts stuff of it, which is creating a storyboard. So, for hard skills, the storyboard is going to be shot by shot. Like step 1 is to open the thing. Step 2 is to take the thing out of the thing, right? Making that up. For the softer skills, it's more like, what do people look like? What is the atmosphere? What is kind of the vibe, so to speak? And really kind of creating that, illustrating that. And then I'll touch on the scripting really quick, and then I do want to leave a decent amount of time for questions. So if you are writing a VR script, keep in mind it's not like a traditional film or video script. People think, oh, I can just take content I've built and stick it in VR, and unfortunately you can't. Sorry. You don't want to be having tons of locations, tons of like moving around, jerking people from one thing to the next. It takes them out of the experience and it's kind of uncomfortable. If you do these quick cuts, right? We've all seen MTV and Miami Vice kind of started this all. I'm dating myself, but like quick cuts on TV, it's fine. In VR, it'll make people throw up. Like, don't want to do that. I like to think of it honestly as like theater, right? Because with theater, first of all, everyone who's in the piece has to like nail their lines constantly. There's no cheats, there's no cutaways, there's none of the tricks that you get to do when you do film and TV. So I almost think of it as like these are all little mini plays, right? And they're all little mini plays that are about like learning how to do a thing or learning, how to behave in a certain way. But if you kind of approach it like that, it becomes like sort of like a lot more fun and it becomes easier to understand. I'm not going to go into the 2 different types of scripts. There's linear, which is basically like you just kind of go through the scenario and that's it. And then there's branching, which is you have choices. That's a little bit deeper for, I think, the sort of introductory level conversation. And then I'll talk really briefly about the virtual humans. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So another thing you can do is use these virtual humans to create conversations. So like was stated at the top of this call, I work for a company called Verti, among other projects. I was like 10 different projects, but Verti is my main project. I also teach and write, do some consulting. But Verti has a product that is these virtual humans. If you go to virti.com, you can sign up for a free trial. It's 14 days. We don't take your credit card, nothing like that. You will get emails, but like we're not going to charge you or anything. And you can actually practice building a virtual human. So virtual humans take about 10-15 minutes to build. It's all powered by ChatGPT. We might be adding DeepSeek as well, but right now it's powered by ChatGPT. And you practice having these conversations. And again, it's easy to build, it's easy to scale. And you get these coaching reports at the end that are, again, AI generated. You get them within like a minute or 2 of completing the piece. And it really shows you like, did you do a good job? Did you hit certain objectives, right? And these are all really easy to custom build. You don't need to know any code. So that, again, is a really cool thing that can scale really, really well in terms of training. The avatar quality is good. It's not realistic, 100%, right? To do that is prohibitively expensive and takes way too much compute power. But that's another thing to try. So definitely, Verti.com, 14-day free trial. Again, we're not charging you. We're not taking your credit card info, I promise. But just a good thing to sort of try and play with. And there's examples of 360 content on there, so you can kind of see some best practices. Some of it is stuff I've created, some of it is stuff that I did not create, but I think is good, right? So yeah, go ahead and have a play with that. So we've got 10 minutes. If anyone has, if the organization is ready to scale up as an expensive device. Okay, so that's a really good question. First of all, the headsets aren't that expensive comparatively. So a headset, let me see if I have one here. So this is, oh my God, ah, everything is falling. So this is an Oculus, it's hard to see because the background is blurry, everything is falling. This is a Quest 3. This is like a couple $100, right? Not everyone needs one of these. You can have a couple of these that people share when you start with this. You can get these, on Amazon. You can get them at Best Buy. There's plenty of used ones on eBay for even less money. I know Meta will not appreciate me saying that, but whatever. There's also a headset maker called Pico that does some really cool enterprise partnerships. You can speak to them. So they're not actually that expensive, right? I think people think these headsets cost way more money than they actually do. In terms of content creation, so Verti is a license model. You pay per seat. They are working on like a pay per use model as well. So that is sort of normal though. If you're using an LMS or a content creation company, they're going to charge the same way, right? 360 camera will cost you a couple $100. There's one called Insta360 that it's on the charger over there, but Insta360 small camera, a couple $100 on Amazon. You can buy a tripod for, I don't know, $30. Like tripods are cheap. Get some wireless mics and you're off to the races. So actually the initial investment is not that much. Also, you can rent headsets. So there are a couple companies that will rent headsets for periods of time. So that's really like if you really are nervous about investing in a meaningful way, do 6-month headset rental. You're still gonna have to buy some equipment, but it's gonna probably cost you less than $1,000 and you're good to go. In terms of readiness to scale up, I mean, you need buy-in and you need executive sponsorship, but that's kind of it, right? It's really just a matter of like making the decision and doing it, and having somebody to manage it and having somebody to kind of be in charge of it. We've seen a lot of large orgs do it and a lot of their competitors still aren't doing it. So Walmart has, historically been a power user. They're having a ton of success, but I don't see Target really doing it in a meaningful way for reasons that are beyond my grasp, reasons that I've never quite been able to figure out. So yeah, I mean, it really is just at this point, just kind of like, you got to go do it. We've got a couple more minutes. Are there any other questions or comments? Anything? I know yeah.
Courtney, I have a question. You mentioned the challenge you had with the basketball heights. Have you had any other, or have you heard of any other challenges that users experience when integrating VR in their learning?
Oh my God, so many. Okay, so the biggest ones that I hear about are, VR sickness, right? Which is not an actual thing. The closest I can explain VR sickness is if you are reading a book in a moving car, right? Your eyes and your body are moving at different speeds, so that's why you might get nauseous. Some people don't, some people do, but that's kind of the reason why. In VR, it's similar, whereas if your eyes and your body are not moving in sync, right, or you're having to move your head really quick, or things are moving while you're standing still, that is what will make people sick. So VR sickness is more just like bad content sickness. There are some people, a very small percentage of the population, who have like sensory issues and just can't wear headsets because they can't have anything on their heads. And that's fine. Like, I want to be respectful of that. But most people are fine with it. It's just sort of like keep the camera stable, right? The camera should not move, right? The action can happen around the camera, but the camera itself needs to be stable. So do not do VR on a boat that is on water, for God's sake. I had somebody ask me for that, and I said, absolutely not. Do not put the camera on someone, because even if a human is standing still as possible, they're still going to be moving. Columbia University, which you think would know better, Columbia University asked me to consult on a piece for them for their med school, and I said, yeah, sure. And they were like, great, we'll send you over the footage that we've shot so far, and you can give us your feedback. Okay, amazing. So they sent me the footage, and I think I got maybe 40 seconds in before I had to like rip off my headset and run to the bathroom, because what they had done is they put the 360 camera on this woman's head. She was walking around the OR, and I was just like, oh no. So yeah, they really needed some help with that. So yeah, I mean, that like the static nature of the camera, not having people come too close to the camera. So that's another thing that when I do these sessions in depth, we film a ton of content, and I film a ton of content that is not good content, but it's illustrative. So if you have somebody like walk right by the camera in headset, that's going to look like they walked right by here. And it's like, we've all talked to like close talkers who are just like right up in your grill, and it's like, no, I don't, like, go away. It's uncomfortable, right? You don't want to create that scenario where somebody's like right here, because that's just, unless you're teaching people how not to be close talkers, that's not good. So yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of little, again, I'll just plug everything. So, I do these workshops for Verti. We do them for our clients as part of our package. We also kind of do them as, one-offs, which ideally then leads to people buying more licenses. So you can feel free to reach out to me about that. We just have sort of a day model, and we can discuss pricing. I also have taught a couple different courses. So I have a course that is like really, really in depth on this with New Mexico State University. So if you want to, like, I think it's like $500 for the entire course, which I think is a pretty good deal because it's like many hours. So I have that. I teach in a program called Fast Future Executive, and Fast Future Executive is fun because it's like I think there's 13 of us, and we all teach sort of different future technologies. So I teach VR and AR. Somebody else teaches AI. Somebody else teaches like the future of mobility, and we kind of tie everything together. So that's really cool. That's more sort of an organization-wide investment. So Fast Future Executive, great program. They're publishing my book later this year. So yeah, they're awesome. I also did a course for Coursera that's more on like the metaverse, if that's of interest to folks, and that's free. So that's up there. Yeah, I don't know, like I just have a lot of stuff on the internet that you can read about this stuff. And yeah, there it goes really deep into like what are the best practices for very specific things. All right, I think we have time for like one more question if anyone has it. Or if not, I can give you 3 minutes back. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. If you want to, if you come up with a question like later, if something wasn't clear, my name is Cortney, Cortney Harding. I am findable on LinkedIn. I'm generally findable on the internet. I have an SEO friendly name, I guess. And yeah, I guess there's a Next Thought Lab. This has been so much fun. Please do feel free to add me, follow up, and thanks so much for having me.
Courtney, before we all leave this Zoom call, I would like to ask everyone, what is one thing that stick with you after this session? Let us know in the chat. Virtual humans, it's a hit. Yeah. The same for you for one. Keep focus on your workshop, on the outcomes you hope participants will get. Lots of practical tips. Thank you. Excel. How do you want people to feel when they are down with your training? When done with your training, focus on the customer, skills versus behavior, skills versus behaviors. Great. Thank you, Courtney, on behalf of L&D Shakers community for sharing your experience with your work. And thank you guys for being here, and ladies for being here. And I also shared the link to the Next Thought Lab. So stay tuned and have a nice rest of the day.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Bye bye.